Good afternoon. Thank you everyone for being here today. As the Commission holds our status conference for Docket 2020-0084, Young Brothers Emergency Investigative Proceeding. We're breaking new ground here today for our Commission as we hold this status conference remotely through WebEx, but also broadcast live, do live stream through YouTube. So please bear with us, but we've tested this out. I'm Jay Griffin, the chair of the Public Utilities Commission, and also in attendance here with our virtual meeting is Commissioner Jennifer Potter, Commissioner Leo Suntian, and also with me from our staff is Dave Parsons, Commission's Chief of Policy and Research, and Caroline Ishida, the Commission's Chief Counsel. A quick overview for the purpose of our status conference today. The purpose is for Young Brothers to provide the Commission and the Consumer Advocate with information regarding Young Brothers' current access to financing and their contingency plans, addressing in particular, where possible, the Commission's June 8th information requests, which were posted on the Commission's homepage in our document management system. On June 1st, 2020, the Commission opened this docket to investigate Young Brothers' financial condition, including to address identified requests for relief that have been filed and may be filed in the future with the Commission. The Commission has emphasized that Young Brothers' continued ability to provide affordable, reliable service to the state is contingent upon Young Brothers stabilizing its finances, mitigating the effect of Young Brothers' current and future financial customers, and improving its long-term competitive position. Any solutions that Young Brothers or any other party recommends in this docket must tie back to those core principles so that Young Brothers can properly balance maintaining financial viability with providing affordable, reliable service to its customers. The Commission reiterates that its concerns regarding Young Brothers' pre-pandemic rising operating expenses and flat or falling revenues, which have resulted in consecutive Young Brothers requests for rate increases to compensate for declining net income. So a little bit about our format and agenda today. I want to briefly discuss this. On June 8th, Commission posted the agenda and the YouTube link for viewing the status conference on our homepage. You can find it at puc.hawaii.gov, as well as within docket number 2020-0084 in our docket management system. Commission streaming live via the YouTube link, and the link will be available for the public to view, but will not be able to log in and provide comments. Any member of the public or organization seeking to file a public comment regarding the matters addressed in our status conference or in this docket overall may do so by emailing the comment to puc@hawaii.gov with docket number 2020-0084 in the subject line. We've posted the public comments we've received so far on our website, as well as in the docket record. Commission's recording the status conference, and the recording will be available on our website and incorporated into the docket record. As noted in the order opening this docket, the Commission invites any interested individual or organization to e-file a motion to intervene or participate without intervention by June 22nd, consistent with the Commission's our administrative rules in Chapter 16-601. For today's agenda, we've allocated 30 minutes for Young Brothers comments and presentation. At the very outset here, we'll be turning it over to Jay Anna shortly. Those remarks and presentation will cover Young Brothers' current access to financing and contingency plans, including their responses to the information requests that we put together. After that presentation, the topics covered in those information requests include Young Brothers' requests for financial assistance and Young Brothers' commitments, Young Brothers' finances both in the short term and the long term, their efforts and commitments to customer service, relationship with parent company, and compliance with HRS Chapter 271G. The following 90 minutes of our status conference, we'll be going through questions from the Consumer Advocate and the Commission regarding each one of these topics. And with that, we will turn it over to Young Brothers now. I believe Jay Anna will speak and go through their presentation. we have our staff for again, Jay, just let our staff member know when to queue up the presentation and advance slides. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Jay Anna. I'm the president of Young Brothers. Before I get started, I'd like to take a moment to thank Chair Griffin, Commissioner Potter, Commissioner Asuncion, and the Consumer Advocate, and all those interested stakeholders who took the time to be here today. We appreciate the opportunity to present on Young Brothers' emergency investigative proceeding and to address any questions and comments. With me today, virtually, I suppose, are my team of Chris Edwards, our Director of Finance and Accounting, Chris Martin, our Director of Terminal Operations, Keith Kiyotoki, our Manager of Sales and Marketing, and Jeff Ono, our Regulatory Counsel from Watanabe Eng. Not with me are the 375 deeply committed YB employees who right now, as we speak, are hard at work delivering exemplary inter-island shipping services that our customers both need and want. I'll attempt to respond to all the information requests that we've received from your office throughout my presentation today. And for those IRs that we can't provide by documents today, we'll continue to work on gathering them and we'll provide them as soon as possible. But there's one particular IR that I want to address first and immediately. And it asks if YB is fit, willing, and able to do what we do. And it would be dishonest for me to stand before you and say that we're financially fit. As you know, commissioners, we've openly stated that our financial situation is dire, and we're here today to seek solutions that will put us on a path toward financial fitness. Are we willing? Absolutely yes. And we're deeply proud of our 120-year history of being Hawaii's trustworthy, dependable partner, both in good times and in bad. And are we able? Yeah, absolutely. We have the equipment, the tugs, the barges, the shoreside equipment, and more importantly, the skilled workforce who work extremely hard every single day to move Hawaii. We can do this job. And if I may add, I'm confident that we can do it better than anyone. We need this, and we need a path that will allow us to become financially viable and profitable. What makes YB unique is that we provide universal service. That includes less than container load service. And this is a service that we provide that no one is available, that no other shipper that moves cargo through the mainland or in the state provides. And we understand the importance of that. So I want to say upfront that our focus is not on filing a temporary suspension of LCL. We understand the importance of LCL to our customers as we provide a reliable and cost-effective service. And it's a portion of our business that we've been doing throughout the history of our company. So our preference is to provide that universal service that includes LCL and mixed cargo, but it has to be done so at a price that reflects the true cost to provide this service. So, Mr. Nishina, we hear you and we agree with you. We don't have enough analysis, and we'll continue to work hard on that analysis. But for today, we'll explain why we need temporary rate relief and how we can continue to allow YB sailing for all of Hawaii. So if we can move to the first slide. Next slide, please. So as referenced, today's agenda or today's presentation is going to attempt to respond to all the information requests that we've received from the PUC's office. For those IRs and requests and documents that we don't have, we're going to continue to work on them and we'll address them later. So this is kind of a coverage. I won't talk through it in detail, but next slide, please. At Young Brothers, we provide universal freight of all kinds through our inter-island tug and barge cargo operations. We don't service outside of the state of Hawaii. That interstate service is provided to our state through Matson or Pasha steamships and through tug and barge companies like Aloha Marine Lines. What we do are provide 12 regulated weekly sailings to and from Honolulu and the neighbor islands. And we provide that service at affordable and just-in-time rates. Next slide, please. In addressing the PUC's first section of IRs, we've provided some information addressing YB's 2020 forecast, the effects of the pandemic, the implemented and ongoing cost containment, and our efforts to secure financial assistance through third-party or other measures. Next slide. What's important about this slide, there's a lot of information here, but what's important here, and it's been presented a number of times, but what's most important is that even before the start of the year, you can see that YB anticipated a loss of about $12.3 million, and that was based on 2019 and other historical numbers. However, the impacts of the state's COVID-19 shutdown have hit our company and our business hard, and Young Brothers and the rest of the state has not been immune to those impacts. And due to the dramatic decline in volume, our 2020 forecasted results have been adversely impacted by about $18.5 million. That being the case, we've taken measures to adjust our business and cost contain with our sailing schedule and our gate hour changes, and those equate to about $6 million in savings. Additionally, we've taken other measures that are largely G&A based that will yield about $1 million in savings by year's end. However, as a comparison to our pre-COVID I guess another point I want to highlight that that needs to be emphasized on this slide is that a comparison of our pre-COVID contribution margin and our post-COVID contribution margin, which are 12.1 and 1% contribution margins, that suggests that our business operates largely based on a fixed cost structure. Next slide, please. Illustrated here are the monthly and forecasted results that make up our $25 million loss projection. What's important to note is that our forecast anticipates some level of recovery. The solid straight lines that are reflected in red as well as yellow represent our pre and post-COVID EBIT run rates. And as we continue through the end of this year, through the end of 2020, we've baked into our recovery, baked into our projection, a recovery of our volumes. But it's not going to be smooth, as you can see, as evidenced by the blue line. It's going to be a rocky road, and our forecasts mimic those of other economic professionals throughout the state. Next slide, please. I won't spend too much time here on the next two slides, but what I want to point out here is that this data set, which reflects revenue tonnage, and the next slide represents revenue dollars, both of which are units of measure to monitor cargo activity for the period between March 23rd and the end of May. That coincidentally covers the same time frame where most businesses discontinued or constricted their operations. What this points out is the change in volume over that period year over year. And what's most important to note is that on both slides, again, by revenue tonnage as well as in revenue dollars, is that over 70% in revenue tonnage and over 60% in dollars of our total drops in volume, almost all of that is, or almost a significant portion of that is represented by our most profitable commodity, which is straight load containers. It should be mentioned that this commodity has been the driver in subsidizing the non-compensatory lines of service, such as LCL and mix. So again, this slide here is revenue tonnage, and if you move to the next slide, this here is revenue dollars. I don't intend to spend too much time here, but just provide that information. Next slide, please. So I talked about our forecast. I talked about what impacts we felt as a result of COVID, the drop in volume. And now I want to talk a little bit about some of the cost containment initiatives that we've already undertaken and those that we will continue to do. These decisions that we've taken as a leadership team have not been taken lightly, but absolutely they were necessary. So again, without getting into great detail, I want to point out or highlight a few of these initiatives that have been implemented to date. So on the table, you can see we've taken some administrative initiatives to the tune of $175,000, and these are the COVID-related administrative initiatives. We've taken some other measures that amount to about $1 million that you see at the bottom of the table. But the administrative initiatives include senior leadership pay reductions, non-essential hiring freezes, eliminating any discretionary expenses, as well as renegotiating our vendor contracts or service reductions. We've also deferred non-essential capital and maintenance. And it should be noted for the vendor renegotiations, that includes both affiliated and non-affiliated transactions with vendors. In addition to those administrative initiatives. Again, that's the first line as well as the line at the very bottom of this table. We've put a halt on our labor loan practices and all related travel. We furloughed tug crew, so the reduction in the sailing schedule has allowed us to operate from with 5 active tugs to 4 active tugs. We've also implemented gate hour modifications, and we've eliminated the regular weekly sailing of the Koholo Auto Roro barge. These are all important because they result in significant savings in our operating costs. And while we understand that there are impacts to customers, like every other business in our community, we're having to make adjustments because, quite frankly, the volumes that exist during this pandemic and continue to exist even after the economy has slowly started to open, the volumes don't justify some of the costs that remain. Next slide, please. So the previous slide, I talked a little bit about the initiatives that we've already put in place. But as I've mentioned, and I'll continue to mention, the buck doesn't stop there. We're going to continue to evaluate. We're going to continue to make decisions. This, again, is not an all-inclusive list, but these are things that are readily and always on the table. We're going to constantly evaluate our headcount, continually negotiate and manage our vendor rates as well as services. As I mentioned, that includes affiliate transactions. And we will look possibly, although that's not our focus, but look to the extent that we need to at further reductions to non-compensatory lines of service to the extent that it does yield impacts to our cash flow and to the bottom line. Next slide, please. So in this next section of slides, I want to focus a little bit about our request for financial assistance. So again, the first set was to talk about COVID impacts, what our financial outlook looks like through the balance of the year, and what we're doing to get there internally. But I think, as I've said before, right, no amount of cost cutting alone can close the deficit, our operating cash deficit. So we've taken initiative in working through and identifying alternate means of assistance. First and foremost, in early March, so before even Young Brothers and the state of Hawaii had closed for business, Saltchuk, our ultimate owner, put together a task force that was focused on the pursuit of CARES Act as well as other government funding in support of its subsidiaries. And so through that exercise, and to date, we've determined that we don't qualify for any of the existing funding mechanisms that are available. Most notably, I think the most popular one that everyone hears about is PPP. We haven't qualified for that due to affiliation rules. Likewise, for the Federal Reserve Main Street Lending program, there's been concerns or issues with required certifications, debt subordination, as well as requirements to pledge assets as collateral. But that being said, we're going to continue to evaluate, alone as YB, but along with the assistance of Saltchuk Marine as well as Saltchuk. In the meantime, as we continue to pursue federal fund access, we've also explored third-party bank financing, and we will continue on an ongoing basis explore the opportunity of emergency relief. Next slide, please. Alternatively, there's some places where we can take revenue streams into our own hands, although it is very limited. But I'm pleased to announce that in our efforts to try to develop and conjure up alternate sources of revenue and ultimately cash, we've secured a temporary common carrier agreement with Matson to carry more cargo than we have been for at least the next 90 days. We're hopeful that we can extend that relationship and pursue opportunities to handle more of that interstate cargo, which is a large and significant subsidy for our interstate commerce. In addition to that, we continue to pursue and explore charter service activities. This is an area of our business over the last several years that's been hit very hard, and even more so due to the pandemic. But as the community, as the states opens up for business, these opportunities will become more frequently. Next slide, please. So, to really focus in on what it is on a short-term basis that we need in order to sustain our services. And I realized, right, this conversation is being performed or being, the forum is a regulatory forum, but I think it's important to lay out all the different means, whether it's regulatory or otherwise, that we're exploring. So, first and foremost, we've talked about it. The $25 million ask has been well documented. The focus largely has been on this CARES grant. And what I want to say about that is that to the extent that we are able to secure a $25 million CARES grant fund, we would be able to continue operations at our currently approved sailing schedule at least through the end of the year, but more than likely through the end of the first quarter of 2021. And I want to also emphasize that again, our focus is not to suspend the less than container load service. It's a universal service that we've prided ourselves on. It does not yield, if suspended for a temporary basis, it does not yield immediate cash returns. And our intention is on a longer term basis to perform that service, but again, at compensatory rates. But to the extent that we're able to bridge 2020, there is still a need for emergency relief, and the amount will vary depending on what kind of funds are accessible elsewhere. But emergency relief would be needed in 2021. And many have asked, well, how much would we need? And based on our initial forecast of volume, as I mentioned earlier, we talked about recovery through the end of this year. But the reality is that the impacts of this pandemic, the impacts to businesses throughout our state's island communities will continue on through at least 2021. And so we expect a rate relief of approximately 25%. What that would yield is a revenue requirement of about $18 to $20 million, which would allow us to operate at a full service level. And more importantly, it would buy us the time necessary to collaborate in developing longer term solutions. Next slide, please. What we have here, again, I think this was filed as part of one of the filings that we've done recently. I don't recall which date, but what's shown here is our cash projection or cash forecast over the next 13 weeks. And what's important to note is that it really demonstrates that if we did absolutely nothing, we project an operating cash deficit as early as July 31st. But keep in mind that this 13-week projection is prepared with conservative assumptions. So, we, like with anything, whether you're managing your home, you're managing any other business, and as we manage Young Brothers, there are always cash needs that arise. And so we've been conservative in developing the cash needs, the cash outflows, and that red bar represents the low cash point in any given week. So, we believe that this is in some ways a worst case scenario, and that our cash will run us likely through the middle part of August or into the latter part of August. That being said, again, this is if we do nothing. And most definitely our intention is to take measures that are necessary in order to preserve and develop the cash needs that we need to run our business. I talked about some of them before, pursuing commercial activities, whether it be CCA relationships, charters, but again, everything is on the table. Next slide, please. A wider view of our cash projections, and this one's on a monthly basis. The prior slide was on a weekly basis. Ultimately, the takeaway here is that, again, $25 million, what that does is it buys us time. It buys us time to resolve our sustainability issues. And it assumes that, but that assumes that we receive the cash in the July timeframe to address liquidity concerns as soon as possible. But again, if you look at this table, that shaded area, what it highlights is that the cash, all $25 million, would not be consumed through the end of 2020. We would have some cash available to carry us into the early part of 2021. Next slide, please. I'm gonna skip. There's a duplicate, so let's just go to the next slide. Same slide. Say thank you. So what I want to talk about here a little bit is the long-term profitability and the future of Young Brothers. What I've talked about previously is that really we need a bridge. We need a bridge through to get us through 2020 and 2021 to provide service for at least another 120 years. The list that we have here is not intended to be all-inclusive, but are just some initial thoughts on the opportunities that we have to preserve Young Brothers' long-term profitability. This list was, based on conversations that we've had internally, discussions that we've had with the regulator, both consumer advocate as well as the Public Utilities Commission and legislators. But the point I want to make is that ultimately any long-term profitability solution needs to be a collaborative effort. We need to work together as one. We need to work together as a state and as a community and come up with some conclusions or some resolutions that will yield positive results for our state. Without diving into the details, just high level, some of the thoughts are greater operational flexibility. So at current, I mentioned, we in normal circumstances sail 12 regulated sailings. So no matter what the barge capacity or the demand is, whether there's one container on it or 300, we have to sail. But we think that an opportunity is to have greater demand-based flexibility that will allow us the ability to manage our costs and navigate and create opportunities for more variable costs as opposed to fixed costs. And likewise, I've talked about this in my prelude or preamble, to adjust or reduce and manage more so the non-compensatory lines of service. I mentioned that the straight load containers were the most significant area of decline as a result of this pandemic. And that's of importance to note because that's the area that for decades, really since from the inception of our 120-year history, the margins on that product have allowed us to manage and subsidize non-compensatory lines of business. But over time, those margins have declined due to rising costs. And even more so because of loss in volume, those margins have effectively vanished. And so we no longer have the form or the means to subsidize this alternate business. Talking about subsidies, one of the thoughts that was presented by the state was that possibly we could explore opportunities to subsidize non-compensatory routes. And I think there is a bill actively being heard by legislator, and it was targeting the small ports, specifically those ports of Molokai as well as Lanai. We've talked about previously, and we've had these in the past, but rate mechanisms definitely, what it does is it helps manage some of the inherent regulatory lag that, quite frankly, over the last several years have while it's inherent in the process, it's also in a rising cost environment contributed to some of the financial shortfall that we've had over the last several years. And then last but not least, and maybe most importantly, we have to continue to cost contain. But again, that has to be a collaborative effort by all. We have to have open and honest conversations and discussions about what that means. And we need to really be willing to compromise all parties. That would be, the regulators, legislators, our customers, as well as Young Brothers, to come up with a solution that works best for all. Next slide, please. Here, again, this is a slide that we put together. It's more for information. Didn't want to dive into this in detail, but again, focusing on what our operating cost structure is, and really highlighting the fact that we acknowledge and we do understand the importance of cost containment. Again, this is more for reference. Next slide, please. The next slide, likewise, it's a similar look, but focused primarily on our G&A costs over the years. And I don't want to speak to this too much, but I just provide it for information. So this can be referenced for those of you that are able to access this slide deck. Next slide, please. So, what the commission asked us to talk a little bit about, in addition to the other items, was customer impact. And we understand the impact that all the changes that we make have on our customers. Or our customers depend on us, and they need us. We provide an extremely vital service to our customers and our community. And so we really realize and understand the responsibility that we have. That being said, I don't think anyone anticipated this pandemic, and no one was really prepared to respond to it. It was, completely unanticipated, unforeseen, and throughout the state, we've seen everybody have to make adjustments. We've done our best to communicate ahead as best we could. If we had our druthers, we would have definitely given 1, 2, 3 months notice for operational changes. But like the local mom and pop store that we have on the corner, right? They've had to make changes abruptly, and likewise, we have at YB as well. Just to speak a little bit about some of the outreach efforts that we've undertaken for operational changes that we've made. We have a email blast, email notification mechanism that goes out to all of our account holders. We also have our account representatives that reach out to our large container shippers and others that they're able to reach. And then last but not least, we have our website and our frontline employees who hand out notices to those that visit our ports. Not an excuse, but just a fact. What complicated our business is that we really service all customers. As I mentioned there, we have account holders, we have non-account holders. We have customers that come once a year, we have customers that come every day. And it's difficult to reach customers that are also, say, customers of customers. But we do our best, and we do not take that responsibility lightly. As far as the sailing schedule itself and its impact, I think relatively speaking, it's gone pretty smoothly. I'm not aware of any cargo being left behind solely because of the sailing schedule adjustments, and most definitely not because of a lack of capacity. Even though in particular the Hilo sailing is going out more full than it was before, and now we're able to stack a little bit higher than we had been. There's still quite a bit of capacity on that barge. That being said, it'd be disingenuous for me to sit here and say that we haven't had hiccups. But what I can say, and I can think of a specific instance where we did have some cargo left behind, but it was left behind not because of the sailing schedule adjustment. In this case, this was for the port of Molokai, where we had an equipment failure. And again, keep in mind, in our business, we have very specialized equipment. We had an equipment failure on Molokai. And because of that, we didn't have backup equipment on that port to discharge the containers off of the barge. What we did was we immediately made a decision to bring that cargo back to Honolulu and connect that cargo onto a barge that was en route to Kauai High. And we discharged that cargo en route back to Honolulu as a stop by to Molokai. Again, I will say that instance and that example of cargo, a cargo miss would have occurred regardless of whether we had a sailing schedule adjustment or not. But we pride ourselves on providing regular and dependable and frequent service. And I understand, right? We have customer complaints, but I think what is not often heard are those customers that would go to bat for us and that would say, of all the cargo that we move, more often than not, that the cargo gets there on a consistent and regular basis. The next piece I want to talk a little bit about is our contingency plans, and I made references to this earlier. And I know in our letter we mentioned that phase 1 of our contingency plan was to move away from the LCL and mixed cargo, and we've deferred that. Our letter referenced the June 8 effective date, subject to PUC approval. And since then, internally, we've made a conscious decision not to accelerate or pursue that timeline. Again, because of the importance and understanding of the vital service that we provide to our communities and our customers. So we've deferred that for the time being, and we're going to do everything that we can to hold the line and ensure that service is provided to our communities. But that being said, what we want to point out in this table is that what we need is to be able to find a way to provide that service at a compensatory level. And the alternatives at current are performed at a far higher price than ours. And so in this table that you see to I guess it's to the right of the bullets, there's a comparison between the cost or the price of Young Brothers service for shipping a front load washing machine. And we use front load washing machine as an example because most everyone knows what those dimensions are and is familiar with the weight of that. At Young Brothers, it costs $63 to move that piece of cargo overnight, basically one day, next day service. For that same cargo, and in these other examples, they're not same day service. It's either 2 or 4 days lag, whether it's an ocean freight forwarder or air freight forwarder. It would cost the consumer or our customer anywhere between $72 and $165 for ocean freight and $120 to $150 by air freight. And the point of this is that they're just cited examples of YB's ability to have performed this consistent, reliable, low-cost service for nearly 120 years. But we're at a point in our history due to the changes in our volume, due to the changes in cost structure, due to changes in consumer behavior, that price mechanism no longer can be suppressed for an extended period, and not at that differential. Next slide, please. So in closing, I just want to kind of recap some of the things. I know we talked a lot about it, many different things, and we did our best in short notice to address the IRs. And I want to reemphasize that for those IRs that we weren't able to address, and for specific, document requests, we will work diligently to get those through to your office. But what I want to focus on is that, and the message I want to leave is that really, this COVID-19 impact just magnified the pre-existing financial problems that we were encountering. We lost higher margin straight load containers, and that's put greater pressure on all areas of our business. And most of those areas have been operating at non-compensatory levels for many, many years. And so what we're here trying to do today and in the coming months is to pave a path to service that extends beyond 2020 and into the next 120 years. But to do that, we need both immediate cash funding, we need some rate relief to bridge the gap into 2021, and we need to find ways to create greater operational flexibility and establish a variable cost structure so that we can manage this business going forward. That being said, we can go to the next slide. It's just a Mahalo slide. So I want to thank you all for your time. I know we still have about 90 minutes. I'm sorry, I think I went a little bit over. But I want to thank you all for your time, both the commission, the CA, as well as all the stakeholders that have taken the time to join this YouTube.
Okay, first off, thank you, Mr. Anna. Thank you for the efforts by Young Brothers to prepare for this. I know it's been short notice for everyone. I just want to say a few things. The commission shares the commitment to service, to continued service to our state. And that's where the dialogue here is going to begin. That's the focus of this investigation. We have posted your presentation on our website, as well as within the docket. And for the remainder of the 90 minutes, we've focused in 5 different areas. We sent this out to both Young Brothers and the Consumer Advocate. And again, those areas, topics to for further discussion are Young Brothers' request for financial assistance and your commitments. Number 2 is really 2 parts: Young Brothers' finances, both in the short term and the long term. Area 3 is customer service. Area 4 is parent-company relationship. And Area 5 is the one you started with, compliance with HRS Chapter 271G. And for those of you following that do not know Hawaii revised statutes, this has to do with the fit, willing, and ableness of service providers to offer the service. And so we'll close on that. We will first turn it over to the Consumer Advocate, Dean Nishina, for you and your staff to ask questions, and then we'll be followed up by the commission staff, led by Caroline Ishida, our chief counsel, and then any questions from the commissioners, starting with Commissioner Santian, then Commissioner Potter, then myself. So with that, I turn it over to Dean Nishina, and thank you.
Thank you, Chair Griffin. I guess as a point of order, I certainly would offer to defer to questions from the commissioners or the commission staff first. But if you're okay with allowing us to go first, I just don't want to ask too many questions and not leave enough time for you folks to ask your questions.
Dean, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
If I can start off with a really general question, if Young Brothers could confirm, because if I recall correctly, the first time that I had heard that Young Brothers would not be receiving further cash infusions from its parent company was in late May. Can YB confirm when they first heard from Saltchuk that cash infusions would no longer be forthcoming from Saltchuk, and then kind of walk through what YB did with Saltchuk to sort of address the situation?
Yes, Dean, I believe, I have to check back my timeline. It's been a blur, but I believe I was notified a day before we reached out to yourself as well as the commission. And from that point forward, we initiated a communication plan. So I don't recall off the top of my head what day that was. I don't remember if that was a Tuesday or Wednesday. And then the next day, I think I reached out to you folks. Since then, all of the steps that we talked through on the presentation are what we've undertaken. Again, we've had discussions with really through Saltchuk Marine. So Saltchuk Marine is the holding company of which our immediate parent. So our immediate parent company is Foss Maritime, which is a wholly owned subsidiary of Saltchuk Marine, and Saltchuk Marine is a wholly owned subsidiary of Saltchuk. So through that leadership channel, we've had discussions to explore opportunities to extend that funding. But to date, we've not been able to secure that. What assistance we've been able to get is they've assisted us in exploring other opportunities. I mentioned the task force team that's exploring, CARES-based and/or other federal loan programs or funding mechanisms. They've assisted in our initial discussions with third-party financial institutions as well. And so my director of finance and accounting also works closely with whether it's the Saltchuk Marine finance team as well as Saltchuk's finance team to bounce ideas and to make sure that we have a strong assessment of our financial position.
Okay, thank you. If I could ask one clarification question on what you just relayed, I think I had heard that YB and Saltchuk have had discussions about getting access to funding from Saltchuk again. Could you elaborate on that and help me understand whether there are certain metrics or conditions under which Saltchuk might decide to provide access to funds to YB again?
Yeah, I don't have any understanding of what specific metrics or measurements. Nothing specific. We've made inquiries to the extent that we, inquiring about, extending the timeline of under which we can continue to get continued funding and/or explored opportunities for, guarantees of other loans. Effectively, the position is that, like any other investor, we at this point don't have the ability to repay our existing outstanding funds, right? So whether it's in the form of debt, in the form of not actual debt, but just drawn funds, we don't have the ability to repay. To the extent that we're able to pave a path towards that and being able to repay, then Saltchuk would definitely and is committed to coming back in and providing that support.
Okay, I'm gonna ask this question. Actually, I was planning on asking it a little later, but in your 2019 financial statements, I think there was it $11.3 million dividend to parent in 2019? Can you explain what that is?
I will defer to my director of finance to speak to that a little bit. I'm gonna have to mute.
Hey, Dean, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Chris. There's a little bit of an echo, but I can hear you.
So
Hold on.
technical difficulties.
Go ahead.
Can you hear me, Dean?
Yes. Do you
Do one
have
of
your
you have
YouTube,
your, or, I
YouTube
mean,
on?
yeah, it could be that, or someone else in the room has their microphone on.
Is that better?
Okay. That's clear, no echo?
Yes, that's much better. Thank you.
All right. So in 2019, we converted to a C Corp. And as part of cleaning up the intercompany balances, it was a journal entry made to effectively roll up into one corporate filer. And that was accounted for as 11.338 dividend, but there was no cash transacted in that. So it's more like, I think what we would call it as a settlement that pushed us to a zero balance in the receivable payable intercompany. So no cash transacted, just because of the way that our sweeps work.
So the normal, I guess, intercompany month end and period end transactions was insufficient to have that reconciliation, and the decision was to use an entry as a dividend payment to parent to clean that up.
To clean it up, yes, just as part of a salt chuck company wide project. That was what they did for all of the opcos.
So other operating companies and other affiliates had similar type of affiliate to parents as a matter of an intercompany cleanup, so to speak.
True statement. Yes, Dean.
Okay, so and the reason I'm asking that question is just to help me understand. So once YB is put on a path of profitability again, is it YB's understanding that Saltchuk will be looking to extract funds, profits, and whatnot from YB again, or will that remain with YB?
I don't think we can speak to what Saltchuk will do, but I think what we have right now, and I'll clarify a little bit about kind of the timeline of the banking arrangements. On May 26th, the sweeps stopped. So effectively, we had cash coming in and going out via our Wells Fargo and First Wine Bank bank accounts, going up and down from Saltchuk. That stopped on May 26th. And then Saltchuk stopped funding us on June 1st. So on the go forward, and then this relates to the cash forecast and our ability to track cash in this entity, there is no more back and forth between our entities. It is completely enclosed now in the YB infrastructure or the banking structure.
Okay, so thank you. So I guess that the answer to the question about whether or not Saltchuk would be seeking to extract or get future dividends or earnings of any kind from YB is suspended until those sweep accounts are started up again, or will it take a formal arrangement between YB and Saltchuk to start that up again?
I suspect it would take a more formal arrangement for us to start that back up again, but we don't know what that future entails yet.
Okay, thank you. I think going back to a statement that Jay Anna had made with respect to investigating other forms of financing, including Main Street, and I think there was a stated concern about having to put up the assets as collateral. Could you folks confirm, because as far as I know, looking at your financial statements, you folks do not have any long-term liabilities right now, right?
I believe. Yes, that's correct. Are you muted?
Hang on.
That's correct.
And so with that, could you confirm that right now there are no existing liens or claims on any of YB's assets?
Not to my knowledge.
And so if you can sort of expand on why you would be hesitant to put up assets that currently have no liens or any other type of claims on them as collateral to get cash infusions in the short term?
The main concern was we have to go through the regulatory process, is my understanding.
So if I can elaborate there, because basically any type of debt financing that you would be entering into that's longer than 12 months would require commission approval anyway. So why would it make a difference whether you would have to put an asset up as recourse or as collateral?
I mean, I guess well, but Main Street, there's a couple of issues, right? It's not just, it is a combination of issues. Asset pledging is collateral, subording, there's affiliate related restrictions on debt that would need to be subordinated at the parent level. And there is also issues as it relates to uncertainty on whether or not Young Brothers could certify, because on the Main Street lending program, there's a requirement that you can certify that there's, and at that time, again, this is when the Main Street lending program was made available, which was, I think, in the March timeframe, and when we explored it, was that there's no access to funding. And through our relationship with Saltchuk Marine and with Saltchuk, at that time, we could not certify to that. Since then, my understanding is that the Main Street lending program funds have ceased. There's a possibility that, similar to the PPP, that it'll reopen, but my understanding is that that's not currently available.
Okay, thank you. But if I might expand on that question, does YB have any concerns with putting up assets as collateral for a loan, regardless of whether it's for the Main Street program or commercial lending? And if so, why? Putting aside that one point about it would require commission approval, and recognizing that commission approval of any debt instrument longer than 12 months would require approval anyway. Are there any other reasons why you folks are hesitant to put up the assets collateral?
No, well, the main concern would be ability to repay. So, like with any debt, at current, we don't have the ability to repay. And so whether that's a concern of the financial institution of our own, that would be our primary concern, but otherwise, no.
Okay. And so you might have to call upon your attorneys in this one, but I guess, has YB looked at the existing statutes, and does YB think that we might have to seek some sort of legislative relief from allowing a loan to help cover operational and maintenance expenses?
I don't have the answer to that question, but as you suggested, we can refer to our legal counsel to look into that.
Okay, I'd appreciate that, because to the extent that YB agrees that it might be useful to get such a change in the statute, that is on a relatively short time frame given the existing condition, pandemic effect on the legislature, and whether or not a draft bill can be put before the legislature so that change could be done in this session rather than waiting until a future session. So I guess I urge YB to look into that, because at least on our side, there is that question of whether debt proceeds can be used for operational and maintenance expenses.
Okay.
And if I can clarify, so YB what is it YB's understanding that Saltchuk is unwilling to make cash infusions in the form of equity, but will Saltchuk make loans available to YB, or is that not feasible?
We looked at that as one of the opportunities, but again, the concern is that at current, we don't have the ability to repay. Based on our current operating cash deficit, we don't have that, we can't service that debt. To this point, we've had the luxury of operating without having a debt structure or a requirement to repay, but doing or anything similar to what you suggested would require that we would have to be able to have that debt service coverage. At this point, I guess the short of it is the answer is no.
Okay. Prior to all of this starting, did Saltchuk have lines of credit or letters of credit that it used for its own purposes and made available to its subsidiaries or affiliates for liquidity needs?
I'm not sure what Saltchuk has at their level. What we would get would be cash, as Chris mentioned. As we needed, we would draw cash through, I guess, a combined account that they had through Wells, right? Yeah, zero balance account. But I'm not aware of what lines of credit that Saltchuk has at their level.
Okay, because the follow-up question was if those types of lines of credit or letters of credit or some sort of commercial paper was available to provide liquidity, are those still available to YB or not? But based on what you're saying, I'm guessing that YB basically just relied on funds coming into that Wells account and didn't actually have access to the debt instrument, whatever it might be.
Correct. That's correct.
So it's my understanding, based on past rate cases and whatnot, that Saltchuk would actually sometimes go out and issue debt, and from those proceeds, then make those funds available to YB. And this is more just for my understanding. Is there a reason why the thought was that that was a better process as opposed to allowing YB to have its own debt in place, with potentially Saltchuk as a signatory to that to support the viability or whatnot? Again, is there a reason why that type of arrangement wasn't explored as opposed to just relying on Saltchuk to always infuse cash into that Wells account?
Again, I don't have all the details on what the specifics are at the Saltchuk level, but my understanding is that through that means there was a better ability, especially in recent history, to access capital. I want to say it was in 2018 timeframe. We went through an exercise, is that right, Edwards? Middle of 2019, we went through an exercise to try to explore third parties financing as a standalone entity. But again, because the utility does not generate positive cash flows and had been sustaining losses for, I guess at that time, a year and a half, but really from a cash flow standpoint, a little bit longer, we weren't able to attract the capital necessary necessary to secure third-party financing.
But that's specific to that exploration in 2019. But I guess maybe predating that, had YB ever considered trying to get its own debt financing?
Not to my knowledge.
And just to follow up that question, and I know this came up in some informal discussions before, but given that YB is a regulated entity, there are certain expectations that I don't want to say certainty, but the regulated entity has a reasonable opportunity to recover its investment and a return on that investment, and even with that, YB's determination was that it would not be able to access commercial lending even if it was reflecting losses or because it was reflecting losses in 2018 and 2019.
Have Chris Edwards answer that question.
Hey, Dean. We explored some independent financing in the summer of 2019, like Dave was saying. We had some preliminary discussions with investment bankers that we were evaluating with through Saltchuk. We were looking to recapitalize our investment in the containment tugs. And the preliminary feedback that we got as they were pitching us was that we wouldn't be able to support the debt structure from a cash flow standpoint, and therefore that we should move forward with rate relief and filing the 2020 GRC rather than seeking independent financing. We filed in September, and the rest is why we're here. Does that help answer some of the question?
To some degree, but I think I'm still struggling with whether or not there's an opportunity for young brothers to seek commercial lending. And I understand that most banks again would be hesitant, and maybe that's an understatement, to loan money to an operation that is in the red. But again, given that Young Brothers is a regulated entity, there are some assurances or expectations that might be attached to that might lend itself to supporting why Young Brothers might be able to access commercial lending, as opposed to a small mom and pop store that's in a similar situation where they're in the red. So I think I'm still struggling a little bit with that, but I guess I'll move on. And I know we've asked this question again informally too. Has Young Brothers considered whether or not there might be an opportunity to seek securitization? And if so, what has Young Brothers done to get that type of support?
So the Can you hear me, Dean?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Okay, sorry. The timing gets off because we have to unmute. So the concept or the thought of securitization came up. I think the first time I had kind of understood that was probably about a month ago. My understanding is securitization would require legislation as well, and so that was identified. But it's a longer term solution, so it's not, again, in looking at how we're evaluating what our opportunities are, we have to address our immediate liquidity needs, our intermediate profitability or liquidity concerns, and then long-term solutions. And so we think that securitization would fall into the latter two buckets.
Okay, so YB is considered, but I agree with you. It probably would be a long-term solution, but for the fact that, again, raising the point that I think I tried to make earlier, if the idea is that legislative support might be necessary, that puts pursuing that on a different time track, unless the idea is to wait until the next legislative session.
Yes, Dean. And my understanding is that unless there are existing bills that we could attach, and again, I'm not, I'm not 100% certain, but unless there are existing bills that are being heard that we could attach some form of legislation to, it would not be heard in this upcoming session. So instead, we would have to focus on the session in January 2021.
All right. And if I can, because the commission had a good question as 1B in terms of trying to get a better understanding of what the company has been able to do so far with respect to soliciting indicative proposals for third-party bank financing. Could you expand I think you tried to address this in your presentation, but if you could expand more in terms of why these efforts have been able to secure to date?
Dean, we've reached out to 3 banking partners. We've received NDAs, and we've distributed financing packages for consideration to receive some indicative proposals on what is in the playbook for a company like ours. We expect early next week, late this week, to get some conversation started. So we're still in the early stages of that.
Do you have a sense of what the timeline might be when you would be able to get an assessment of whether it's thumbs up, thumbs down, and what type of amounts might be made available under what terms and conditions?
I think we can get a good feel next week. You know, as you know, as you go through a process like that, there is red tape in those entities that we would be working with, and we would work as quickly as possible to ensure that funding. But it's hard to predict what that timeline would start to look like once we get going. But we would be going as fast as we could.
Okay. If I can you help me understand? You said you reached out to 3 banking partners. Is there a reason why 3 was selected? Would a larger pot be better, or would it be worse? Can you help me understand the thought process?
Yeah, I think, you know, so generally speaking, we reached out to 2 of our existing partners and 2 that are Salt Chuck partners, and hoping that we could, while not having Salt Chuck guarantee the debt structure, have them familiar already with our company and our services. So we were hoping that we would utilize that relationship that was already in play, and then it might accelerate any kind of funding that we could get out of them. And then another was a big banking partner here through relationships that, you know, Jay and I had.
Can you share, or if it's subject to an NDA, I guess we'll have to ask the question differently so that the information can remain undisclosed. Can you share what type of financing and the amounts you're seeking?
I think that's what we're looking to understand, what is in the possibilities for us. As we looked at it last summer, we were looking somewhere in between $20 and $30 million to recapitalize the tugs. We'd be seeking something similar to that, but that's all dependent upon what the banks are willing to work with us on.
Depending on, so I guess as a general question, if I might ask, depending on the success and feedback that YB gets as it relates to commercial lending, as well as there might be an opportunity to get grant funding or whatnot from CARES Fund or different sources, does YB, and this is getting to the Commission's 1C question about temporary or emergency rate relief, because based on what I got from the presentation, I think YB has indicated that it intends to still move forward with temporary or emergency rate relief. But depending on what YB is able to access either through CARES funding or other commercial lending, does YB anticipate that affects what might be the ask in that, or does YB anticipate that the requested emergency relief would be for $25 million?
Dean, can you hear me?
Yes.
We shifted. You know, so again, the amount of the ask would vary depending on what we're able to get access to, obviously. So there would be some scale there. I guess if the more pointed question, and I think once he asked, do we still anticipate filing a request? And the answer to that is yes, but the amount of the request would vary depending on what it is. CARES funding, on any other funding, all that does is it bridges the need for cash in the immediate term, but it doesn't support that debt service. It doesn't support our ability to repay. CARES funding, again, is not debt service, but that only addresses the concern through, as I mentioned, the early part of 2021. Whether it's in the form of emergency relief or general rate increase, you know, our preference would be to the extent that we're able to secure CARES or other type of funding, would be to focus on our general rate increase application. The funding would buy us time to continue to navigate and pursue and complete that process.
And does YB have a sense, its own internal timeline as it relates to when it anticipates, and this was included in our letter to the commission, that the need for emergency or temporary rate relief is something that should be considered. But I guess, does YB have its own timeline as to when it might be able to provide numbers as to what that relief would be, and when that would be put before the commission?
We plan on filing an emergency relief as soon as possible. Part of our focus, I don't want it's going to sound like all our eggs are in the CARES basket, and that's definitely not the case. But that is our focus, because in large part to address the liquidity concerns over the next, from the moment that this happened for the next 13 to 60 days, emergency relief wouldn't have put or bridged that gap. Because as you know, right, going through the process of emergency relief, getting it granted, applied, granted, and then put in place through our tariff, and then collecting it, that's at least 90 days out, at least, from the point that we did it. And if we started that on May 31st, it wouldn't have addressed any of our liquidity concerns. So our first and foremost focus was to address the cash needs of the first 90 days, with a focus concurrently with emergency relief, and as far as the amount, I think the decision at this point for us is to go in assuming we're not going to get other means, and to try to bridge that otherwise, bridge it through other sources of funding. And so, but to the extent that something else comes in and we have to scale back that emergency relief, then we'll go through that approach. Thoughts of use of regulatory liabilities are also concepts that we've discussed. So, I think one question came up: what happens if we got $25 million in CARES funding and we got emergency relief? How would that be managed? And just a preliminary thought that's not fully vetted is that the CARES funding, it could be used to bridge the gap until rate relief came in, and any, I guess, excess could then be used as a regulatory liability, amortized over a period of time to ratepayers to subsidize rates over that, whatever that rate period is. Again, these are just different concepts that we've floated, but nothing has been fully vetted or materialized. But again, the reason why there's not a filing in those regards is because the focus is to address the next 30 to 90 days.
Okay, thank you. I guess it's come up a couple of times, so I'll just ask the question. Does YB have a response to the question or point that we tried to make in our filing yesterday with respect to our understanding that the CARES funding is limited to COVID-related expenses, and that based on an observation of YB's condition pre and post the stay-at-home order, $25 million seems to be much greater than what might be attributable to COVID. Is it, and perhaps, and I'm going to maybe try to answer my own question, but I certainly want your feedback. But is it where YB is asking for $25 million because it wants to cover 2020 COVID-related expenses as well as 2021?
So 2020, the $25 million, so $25 million is based on our anticipated forecast through the end of the year. And so, again, like you had mentioned, right, there's this discussion about what's pre-COVID, what's post-COVID. But the means for YB to recover losses have been inhibited because of COVID. And, a general rate increase effort was a process that we were undertaking to address even pre-existing losses, but that door has largely closed because of uncertainty related to COVID and because of the small businesses' inability to pay the rates necessary to recover those losses. But even more, even if it's not 25 million, as we saw in, and I don't recall what the slide number was, I think it was number 2, but if you break down the columns, the impact to our business from a COVID perspective is still $18.5 million, which is a significant number. Again, obviously the $25 million ask would be used to carry and operate our business as long as we can. So the anticipation is that it would run us through the early part of 2021. But the way that that number was developed was based on the 2020 forecasted performance in anticipation of also supplementing the balance of the 2021 year with whether it be emergency or general rate relief.
And just to follow up on that question, I don't know all of the criteria that the Department of Tax and other agencies who are actually responsible for determining how much of the funds might be made available. And then I know there will be reporting requirements attached to that because the state is going to have to certify that it was used for COVID-related expenses. Has Young Brothers looked into that? And are they certain that they can justify that of what the ask is, they can support the expenses that it has forecasted as COVID-related as actually being COVID-related expenses as opposed to some combination of COVID-related expenses and lost gross margin?
I can't speak to what the requirements of reporting requirements of DOTAX are, but I can say that we are tracking our loss of revenues separate from those that relate to the normal course of business.
Okay, but then again, sorry, and I know it's sort of a complex question. Is the 18 million, give or take, that YB is holding out, does that include both what might be deemed COVID-related expenses as well as loss of revenues or lost gross margin?
It represents the loss in volumes attributed to specifically the COVID pandemic and the longer tail economic implications of the pandemic.
Okay, and that's probably something that Young Brothers needs to look into, and I believe the state is looking into it as well about whether or not any CARES funding can be made available as it relates to what is calculated to be lost sales, lost revenues, lost gross margin, which kind of led to the point I think I was trying to make in the filing the other day with respect to we'll need to have other types of contingencies in place, because assuming that the understanding is correct, then $25 million may not be a reasonable expectation from the state in terms of supporting access to CARES funding. So again, it would be helpful to get a better sense of what might be clearly COVID-related expenses versus what might be lost sales, lost revenues, or lost gross margin, as well as what might be the underlying existing condition that needs to be addressed, perhaps through a general rate case. If you can give that thought, you don't need to respond to it, but I think Young Brothers needs to think about that a little bit, because I'm pretty sure if it's going to continue to move forward asking for that type of assistance from the legislature, that type of support will be asked for.
So Dean, I guess, I'll point again to that exhibit that is included in our presentation that isolates separately the COVID-related expenses as well as the COVID-related losses of volume. So the volume attributed directly to COVID. We track separately what our run rate was pre-COVID and what our run rate has been post-COVID. So that 18.5 million in combination with expenses, incremental expenses incurred to manage our business, whether it's increased safety supplies and such, are directly attributed to the COVID circumstance. The columns separate and really walk what our $12.3 million pre-COVID expected financial performance was, all the way through our forecasted year-end 25 million.
Okay. Sorry, and this is a clarification question as well. Does that particular presentation reflect only intrastate or interstate?
That presentation is everything. That is, at this point, the focus is managing the business. While I understand that the regulators' focus is on intrastate commerce, the reality is that the interstate commerce, there is a marriage between the two. They need each other. The interstate commerce is needed in order to subsidize the intrastate piece. And as in terms of managing our cash over the next 30 to 90 days, we're looking at both. I guess as a follow-up to the original commentary, the focus is on $18.5 million as a 2020 impact. The fact of the matter is that the COVID impact losses are going to continue into 2021 and even beyond. So, there's also that, and we'll continue to track that into future years.
Okay, no, thank you. I mean, that was my understanding, because I think at certain points I was assuming that the filings before the commission were primarily intrastate, but I acknowledge that, what YB is looking at and what we should be considering is the entirety of YB's operations. I think you probably recognize, though, that any type of temporary rate relief or permanent rate relief will, as it usually is, will focus on just the intrastate operations, and YB will need to find other solutions as it relates to the losses that I think was reflected on some of the slides you showed with respect to the declines in cargo volume as well as revenues for the interstate side of YB's businesses.
Yes, and I don't know if you see, I don't know if you're watching the video, but I gave you a thumbs up, and we're in agreement. I realized after that that it's just your voice, so I don't know if you're called in. But to that point, I guess I wanted to add that, to the extent that we are able to receive, whether it's emergency or general rate increase effort relief, our CCAs are built so that those increases that run through Tariff 5A, maybe not necessarily immediately, but they eventually trickle into the CCAs themselves. So there's a natural relationship between the two.
All right, thank you. And I'll apologize again. I'm noting the time, and I do want to be very respectful of the commission. So I definitely have more questions, but Chair Griffin or commissioners, would you like to ask questions that are burning in your minds? Otherwise, I can go on.
No, Dean, I appreciate that. I think the commission does have a number of questions prepared. We'll see. We'll come back around. And so maybe let's start with our Chief Counsel, Caroline Ishida.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Jay. I just want to follow up quickly on a topic that Dean Nishino just left off on, related to the $25 million in CARES funding requested. And Jay, Anna, you mentioned that you didn't want to put all of your eggs in the CARES Act funding basket. So my question is, planning-wise, how is YB planning for the possibility of less than $25 million in CARES Act funding, and particularly as it relates to these various moving pieces, the emergency rate relief, the regulatory liabilities, and third-party financing?
So as I mentioned previously, we're looking at every opportunity, leaving no stone unturned. So some of the focus is to conjure up commercial business, right? The charter activities as well as the Matson relationship, hoping that we can extend that into a longer relationship that exceeds 90 days. In addition to that, we're continuing to pursue what other federal opportunities might be there. But to your point, Caroline, at some point, to the extent that there's nothing else available and emergency relief doesn't do the trick, right, there's going to have to be some form of a constriction to our business. So we are going to continue to have to evaluate different opportunities to scale. As I mentioned previously, what complicates things is that our business as a logistics company is not structured to scale. The barge operation, LCL operation, those are largely built on a foundation of fixed cost. And so the only way to reduce and manage the cost is to, eliminate whether it's a barge or a service, right? Our intention is not to reduce services to our customers, but in order to manage costs, those are the only real levers or significant levers that we have. It doesn't mean that we're not going to continue to look at it. I mentioned already that to date, we've instituted initiatives that will yield savings of about $7 million But there's a point, right, where we can't continue to pull the same lever to a point where we either operate unsafely or we can't meet the requirements of whether it's from a compliance regulatory standpoint or other. And it should be noted that, throughout all of this, first and foremost, the safety of our employees, our highly skilled workforce, is our priority. Many of the decisions that we made, while unpopular, were made in pursuit of ensuring that our men and women operated safely and were not exposed to the pandemic. So like every other business and like every other business today, even as those businesses reopen and we visit in our normal course of lives, there's a new normal, right? You can't go anywhere without a mask. You can't go in places and congregate as large groups. And operating on the dock is no different. There's got to be some adjustment.
Okay, thank you. I had a follow-up question related to your mention of your calculation of savings of $7 million, and I believe that you included that table in slide 9. I'm wondering what time period over which those savings are forecasted for each of those categories, or if it's the same time period.
It's all through the end of the year. So, all of them were implemented at various times. Some pre-COVID. I mentioned the $1 million that was at the bottom of that table, I believe, or I don't remember, second to the last row, I think it was. That was implemented before this pandemic, and then everything else was after. Thank you, Andrew.
Okay, so then that also means that you would be contemplating those savings under a situation where the temporary sailing schedules that are temporarily in place that the commission issued an order on recently would be in place through the end of 2020.
Correct. The recent. So, and let me clarify. This sailing schedule adjustment, or the impacts of the sailing schedule, relate to our original modification, which was the reduction of hilo, elimination of kahului, and the change in the Molokai sailing with the stop by. With our recent sailing schedule adjustment, which shifted hilo barge operation from Thursday to Monday and added an additional sailing to Molokai, that there is a slight increase in cost to us. That's not accounted for in this, but we are going to fund some of the increase, or use some of the funding through the increase of revenues due to our relationships with Matson, and hopefully what we believe are likely realized opportunities through charter activities in order to support the island of Molokai.
Okay, thanks for that. I have just to switch gears really quickly. You had mentioned that YB does not qualify for federal PPP funding because of affiliation rules. Can you talk a little bit about what those rules are and why you don't qualify? And this is particularly in light of the information about your change in relationship with Saltchuk as of June 1st.
We still remain as a wholly owned subsidiary of Foss Maritime Company, which is a wholly owned subsidiary of Saltchuk Marine. Through that entity relationship, we, as a Saltchuk Marine entity, employ more than 500 employees. I believe the requirement is for PPP for small businesses. The small business designation is for companies with employees with workforces less than 500.
Okay, that's all I have on this topic for now. I'm happy to turn the rest of the time over to the commissioners.
Commissioner Asuncion.
Thanks, Jay. Thanks, Jay, for the presentation. I just have a couple of questions. Some of it is more clarification as well. The first one I have is, and on slide 9, right, we mentioned the elimination of the weekly Kaholo Roro sailings. But obviously there is still some need, right, for it. So is it being made up somewhere else in another sailing, or you're just saying there's no more roll on, roll off sailing?
So what that is based on, prior to the pandemic, and I think it started in 2018, we had committed to address auto volume needs, effectively a weekly sailing of the Ko'olo. We would alternate ports of destination between the Wili Wili 1 week and then combined service to Hilo and Kahului in alternating weeks. We did that for a period of about a little over 2 years. Most recently, what we've done is well, with obviously the pandemic, we discontinued that largely because the primary consumption of that is auto dealers, rental car agencies, and to a lesser degree POVs. But for the most part, POVs we can put on our flat deck barges. But the primary consumption is these large consumers of vehicles, and with the stay-at-home, stay-at-work proclamations on all islands, that volume dried up. Since then, there's been some uptick. We actually sailed the Ko'olo, I believe it was last week, and so I guess the thought there is that we're going to sail it based on demand. Keep in mind that the Ko'olo sailing, while we were sailing it weekly, it's not in our tariff as a regulated sailing. We would use it as an overflow. We could put some containers on it periodically, but it really only has a capacity of, I think, of about 30 containers. And so at current, we're going to continue to use it through those means to service as needed. One of the solutions that I referenced in our long-term strategy is to devise means with our schedule to really do demand-based sailing. We can have some level of consistency, but for example, in Kahului, whereas we had 3 regulated sailings, to be honest, even pre-COVID, we probably could have did with just 2 and consolidated. But one thought is that we could do 2 regulated sailings and then 1 intermittent one that focuses maybe primarily on more efficient straight load volumes, both intra as well as interstate, but it's going to sail based on demand. If we don't have capacity on the 2 regular sailings, we add another. That will add some variability to our cost structure that will truly allow us to manage the business.
Okay. The next one I had, and this is I think just for clarification in as far as my understanding of what was presented. So you guys are not going to be seeking temporary suspension of less than container load cargo, but then in order, right, is there, I guess, a possibility, right? Right, you're either gonna kind of come back, right? So you're gonna keep doing it, and at some point, right, there might be an uptick, right? Probably not to any levels of 2019, but some kind of uptick this year, right? So either you're gonna operate on the reduced schedule, but still accept, right, all the LCLs, right? Or if you return to a more regular schedule, you guys are saying that, right, that's where we need to kind of look at the rates for it, right? And then I assume it's going to be somewhere along, I think one of the slides you had, right, how much the cost to you guys versus air cargo versus, right, so it's going to be somewhere, right, I wouldn't say on par with that, but somewhere in that, obviously an increase, right, to those rates. Is that?
Let me, I think I get the gist of what you're asking. So let me attempt to respond to that in maybe a more long-winded manner than you'd prefer.
Well, I think I'm just trying to make sure I get some clarification in my mind.
Yeah. And I'll clarify. I think this, I think this will help. But please correct me if I'm wrong or stop me if it's too long. Our focus today is not to suspend LCL service, but at a point in time, it may be necessary. Again, we pride ourselves and we value the ability to service our communities and our ability to differentiate ourselves from every other shipper. As we mentioned previously, there's not a shipper anywhere that provides the service that we do. That's what makes us different. But there's a reason why the others don't do it, because generally speaking, it's not profitable. It's a difficult business to manage at the margins and at the expense of other parts of their business. So they focus elsewhere. But that's not who we want to be. We want to continue to do that, but we have to bridge the gap. That being said, while that's not our focus, if we're not able to get close to compensatory rates, or maybe at least break even. If we're not able to get close to that in that area of business, we can't do that and continue to lose money. And it should be noted that our large customer base that really carries the bulk of our business, the intrastate, the containerized, not intra and interstate containerized cargo movers, as they continue to subsidize our business over the years, they've found alternate means. They've bypassed YB as a means to transport, whether it means that they establish distribution channels on the neighbor islands to be able to ship direct, or they bypassed us through forms of SIT. And that's because they just got to a point where, like, I'm not going to subsidize these other businesses that I don't use that service. And while it was okay for a period of time, that's no longer the case. So I guess I don't want to say that we'll never explore that. Our intention is not to, but everything is on the table.
Thank you. Going to slide 7, the cargo volumes, right? And obviously that is, right, the entire, all of YB's operations, right? Every port and the like. I assume as you look at these numbers, right, you guys also use this not only on the cost budget side, but also, right, the amount of service or the type of service you need to provide to a certain, and I'm going to assume that you guys have this all broken down by ports as well, right? What's going in and out and things like that. So I just wanted to make sure, right, that, like, yes, we have this cargo volume, but you guys are also using that because, right, as you look at these numbers, right, and you start to see upticks, and you're going to probably see them from one port versus another, right? I think we would expect, right, you might have changes in sailing schedule, just like what you guys did currently, right, did recently, right, to look at what is the demand, what is kind, and what is possible. Because, like I said, I think in another conference call that we had, you guys know the business better than me. Right? You guys got all the data to do, right, optimize, right, sailings and do it in an efficient and, right, cost-effective manner, right, to the company. I just wanted to make sure on that you guys do have that kind of data, and maybe we need to also recognize that, right? These are just not numbers that are used for budget. It's really to look at, right, the complete operations of YB.
Absolutely, Commissioner Section. So this data set, and I think I've shared a different iteration of this with you folks before. And in that look, it showed what our volume was by port. And that data set was used partially to make some of the decisions that we made as it relates to our sailing schedule adjustment. I will say, however, that we don't make decisions solely based on numbers, because if it was simply a dollars and cents, simply a volume-based decision, the vital communities and our brothers and sisters on the islands of Molokai and Lanai would not receive the necessary service that they need. And so we have to find and weigh a balance between what's appropriate from a monetary or volume standpoint and what's socially responsible.
Okay, and then on staying on this slide, just want to make sure, right, the sum of 2020, that's only from March 23 through May 30th, right? It's not January 1 to May 30th.
Correct. So before that, obviously, I think our volume, this is a revenue tonnage, our revenue tonnage was a lot closer year over year relative to 2019. I think we were at, I want to say revenue tonnage was 0.5%, like 0.6% less than 2019's volumes. And so in large part, almost all of our loss of volume is attributed to COVID. And I think as CA Nishina referenced, like, how do you make that distinction? there's one column. We had the $12.3 million on that P&L illustration. The next column, I think, showed about $200,000 net impact pre-COVID. That's the adjustment with respect to things that are not COVID related, whether it's volume or other initiatives that we took even before COVID was a thing.
Okay. I think that's all I had. The CA actually asked some of the questions that I had written down. So thanks, Dean, for doing that. Chair, I'm done.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner Asuncion. Commissioner Potter.
Hi there. First off, thank you very much, Jay, for your informative presentation. And we appreciate the communication that you've had with us over the last several months at this point. It's been very helpful in assessing the situation here. I have a few questions about some of the numbers that you've provided regarding the losses related to COVID. And I'm taking them from several different areas, so bear with me. The first is coming from your May 29th letter, where you indicated that, it's on page 2, you indicated that the COVID pandemic has resulted in nearly $8 million in loss through the month of April 2020. I understand that there's a little bit of other losses also attributed to that. For example, in the spreadsheet that you provided on the fifth slide of your presentation indicates that $1.6 million have been a non-COVID impact due to reductions in general freight. However, on the slide 8, yes, it looks as though you have a sum of about $4.9 million that you're attributing to March and April and May. That's as Commissioner Asuncion just highlighted, is that's only 3 months of losses there. And so I guess my question is why is there this discrepancy? And then I have a follow-up question to that.
I don't know. I'll attempt to track it. I think what the letter was saying is through April, we had lost already $8 million. It wasn't necessarily making a distinction between COVID related or not, but it was tracking that we had lost $8 million through the end of April, which in some ways was just reflecting, if you take that run rate through the end of the year, you normalize it, it's not far off of our $25 million projection. And it's, again, and I guess even more what it was intended to accomplish, and maybe accomplish isn't the right descriptor, but what it was intended to convey was that for the year, we thought we were going to lose $12 million, a little more. Right. Through April, we already lost 8. In large part, that was driven by the pandemic. Does that make sense?
I think so. Does it make sense to you?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I want to make sure that I answered your question.
Yeah, no, I do. I think you did. I still think there's some ambiguity there, but we'll get to that. I think one of the other things that I'm a little bit concerned about is the actual assumptions that you're using to forecast these revenue decreases throughout the end of the year. Obviously, it's based on tonnage, and there's a great deal of uncertainty at this point of where you can project, your sales will actually be and your revenues will actually be from, the types of cargo that you'll be hauling, and then even your sailing schedule, right? There's uncertainty around that. So you have a lot of balls that you're juggling in the air right now and trying to do these types of forecasts to come up with the projected $18 million in lost revenue due to COVID, and then also the need for $25 million of CARES funding. Can you briefly describe some of the assumptions that you used within the forecast in order to come up with these estimates?
Yeah, high level as much as I can, and then I guess to the extent that I'm not able, I'll defer to our Director of Finance. But for starters, our modeling is based on a Monte Carlo modeling formula that we use that takes into consideration best and worst case scenarios, right? And so it uses our assumptions based on inputs from operations teams, from our sales group, as well as from actual data. And so what we've been doing during the course of this pandemic from the very beginning was tracking well, what is the loss in volume for each of these commodities? So in large part, the model that, or the data set that we saw that Commissioner Asuncion was referencing was used in order to help develop some of the assumptions. Because as you know, right, assumptions are, you know, at first without data, they're wags, right? They're wild ass guesses. But from that point forward, to the extent that you can integrate known and measurable information, you can refine your assumptions. And so as we've continued to progress throughout this pandemic and accumulated on a weekly basis more information as it relates to cargo fluctuations, we've put that, or we've taken that into consideration of developing our assumptions, focused primarily in this case on the revenue tonnage and the revenue stream. Now, the other assumptions as it relates to sailing schedule, you know, we've assumed for this at this point, based on economic forecasts for the state, based on the results of the revenue forecast through the Monte Carlo modeling, that we're not going to recover immediately, and we're going to be slow to recover as a state. So we've made the assumption that from a sailing schedule standpoint, that we would operate with our existing sailing schedule at least through the end of the year, because based on that, we have enough capacity with largely a two-time weekly sailing for most of our ports, and that we would be able to manage that volume through that offering. Chris Edwards, did I miss anything? Okay, thank you.
Great, that's helpful. I have one more comment or question for you. So you're asking for $25 million in CARES funding. You were assuming at the beginning of the year that you would have about a $12 million deficit between your operational expenses and your revenues. And so you've reduced your cost, right? Your handling expenses and your expenses, operational expenses, by about $7 million. So now we've reduced that 12 million down to about 5 million, correct? Right. So you have $18 million that you're attributing to COVID at this point from the lost sales, et cetera, which also does include interstate losses, right? So we'd have to accommodate for that, because I'm pretty sure that we can't use COVID funding for anything that's not Hawaii based. I'm not sure, but that seems to be, I'm speculating. So ultimately what we come down to is there's still a gap between the 25 million and the 18 million that you've requested from federal and state assistance. Where are you attempting to cover that operational loss that was projected from the test year into the COVID funding or the CARES funding? Is that what you're attempting to do there? Does that make sense?
Not intending to do. I mean, that is initially how that number was derived. I guess the first comment I'll make is to our knowledge, there's no limitation on whether COVID or CARES funding has to be used for intrastate versus interstate commerce. While interstate commerce did not originate in the state of Hawaii, it's commerce that's necessary to support the communities throughout the state of Hawaii, and in large part, much of that commerce is even more necessary. I mean, we talk and joke, you know, throughout our communities about everyone panicking about toilet paper, about soap, and about disinfectants. Well, you know, until recently, almost all of that, and really still, almost all of that comes through interstate commerce. So we need to continue to support interstate commerce. And there is this marriage between inter and intra, because, you know, whether it's YB or other service provider, intrastate commerce is not feasible without that interstate relationship. That subsidy is necessary to perform and provide the low-cost regular service, because demand is not going to be able to support twice weekly and or more service. But secondly, I guess to address the number, again, the 18.5, you know, we asked for 25. The math works out. It just so happened to work out that it covers through the end of the year, or the P&L through the end of the year. But as I mentioned, our intention is for that cash to operate for the point that we receive it going forward. And our hope is that we'll receive it as soon as July 1st to cover those losses through the end of the year. I think I mentioned that would cover that cash need is about $18 million, and the balance would be used to carry us into the remainder of, or the early part of 2021. But it should be noted that the impacts of COVID are going to carry on in beyond to 2021. So really 25 was just because you have to put a face to a name, you have to put a number to what your ask is, but those losses are going to continue to accumulate. And we just have, but if we have variability in our business and we have some flexibility in how we manage, we can pull some levers to offset to the extent that the rebound doesn't occur as well as we would like or hope.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. Great. I think I'm done. I go back and yield to you, Jay. Chair.
Okay, thank you. Andrew, can we bring up slide number 6 from Young Brothers' presentation? And this is, here we go. Okay, so Jay, just so I'm clear, the red line here, and it's all red, right? This was pre-event. These were your projection of the monthly losses. So basically projecting about losing, or what you call the run rate of losing $1.5 million a month. And so, I mean, the topics come up. I think my understanding is that the CARES Act money does have to be used for, I mean, there needs to be a direct tie to COVID related needs funding. So, I mean, this graph clearly shows that, you know, that obviously the losses got worse, but there was sustained losses prior to this. You know, your own financials projected $12 million for this year coming in. So that, I mean, that's going to be a discussion with others in the state, but I mean, your graph here demonstrates that. I guess my longer term question though is, even if you take the 25 million, all this says, if I follow the blue line, is that you get back to the pre-event losses. We're back to, I mean, it's just getting back to losing money, right?
Correct. So I'll address that in 2 separate pieces. So the red line again was demonstrated what the run rate was pre-COVID, before we took any and implemented any of the initiatives that we had undertaken. So as Commissioner Potter referenced, we've taken initiatives since that run rate was in place to the tune of about $7 million. So whether it's adjusted sailing schedule, G&A, adjustments, you know, so reevaluating vendor contracts or discontinuing specific services, that saves out of the 13 million, I guess it was, yeah, between 12 to 13 million dollar pre-COVID loss, we saved about $7 million by pulling levers. But 18.5 million is attributed to the loss in volume directly due to COVID. Now, you're correct. Even with the recovery, with the rebound, as our economy recovers and volumes start to return, with the reopening of tourism and other businesses, we'll get back to at some point pre-COVID levels. But as you recall, and that's why we indicate at some point rates are still necessary, right? Even pre-COVID, the CARES request is to address the concerns specific to the circumstances that were driven due to COVID. But from a regulatory perspective, we still had problems with rates. We're performing services or providing services at non-compensatory levels, and we can't continue to do so.
And so I take it from that, your answer to fix the rest of this is to raise customer rates. I mean, to fix the structural underlying losses, that's your primary means of addressing that, becoming profitable again.
No, it's well, I would say it's part of the
solution. That's what I think I just heard.
It's part of the solution, but it's not the entire solution. So again, the CARES money or any other form of funding will provide relief through 2020 into the early part of 2021. There is a need for increase in rates to carry us through 2021. During that time, over the following, or even starting now, to the extent that we get funding, we propose a collaborative effort between the regulator, legislators, us, and other government agencies to evaluate how we handle LCL mix and what those implications are should we choose to redirect and push that service to freight forwarders. What are the economic impacts? we don't have the means independently to do that. We need to partner with everyone to understand how that affects small businesses throughout our state, because it's not, the cost containment is about managing these different types of areas of our business. As we referenced in that other table, you know, we're providing a service to move a washer at $65 that everyone provides for, in some cases, 180, and we deliver the cargo faster. It's not solely an issue of our cost is just too expensive, because the air freight forwarders, the ground freight or other freight forwarders are providing it at a much higher cost than us because the cost structure needs it. And they're using different labor than we have. So it's not an issue unique to our labor. It's just the cost of the effort because it requires a lot of handling.
Okay, I do have more questions on costs. I realize time is, we've run through a lot of time. So I think what we're going to do, I do have one more question, then we're going to do basically one more round of questions. But if we can go, Andrew, to slide 13. And this gets, again, we asked questions about this in our IRs. And so, okay, again, this is related to the, you know, bullet point 1 on the left, $25 million request for CARES grant. If received, Young Brothers will be able to continue operations through 2020, first quarter of 2021. Second bullet point, Young Brothers will no longer seek temporary suspension of less than container load cargo. What we asked in our IRs are, what are your commitments? Do I read this as a commitment, or do I read this as maybe if we get it, maybe this will happen? It's still up in the air. Your company, what is your company willing to put in writing if it receives assistance?
Well, if we receive assistance, again, as I mentioned, we will provide the service that's needed. What I just caution is that if we have to provide all services of all kinds to all ports, regardless of demand, that burn rate through the $25 million will accelerate. What we're communicating today is that at the existing service levels, today we're providing LCL, mixed service, straight load service to all ports with a limited sailing schedule. So at that sailing schedule, we're committed to providing, if we are able to secure $25 million, that service through the early part of 2021. But there still needs to be a solution beyond. As you referenced in the cash flow projection, there needs to be a band-aid of rates, interim rates. We already had, even pre-COVID, rate request in September of 2019 for 2020, for a 2020 test year, a 34% rate increase. What we're looking to now is a 25% rate increase that in 2021 largely would still put us at break even. You know, there's no allowed rate of return or reasonable rate of return asked in either request for 2020 or 2021. But ultimately, we do need to get to a path, preferably or hopefully in 2022, where we are making a reasonable rate of return and that we're viable and we can attract the capital necessary to sustain our business. But while that's all going on, our objective to evaluate and restructure our business is to focus on how do we manage LCL and mix. Again, today, it is a costly business, but we want to continue that service, but we can't do so at these rates. So at some point, we need to decide, is that a service that the utility is going to continue to provide without any form of compensation? Because it can't be done. And there's got to be some balance there. Now, you know, on a longer term basis, do we push that to freight forwarders or do we keep it? That is still up in the air, and we want to collaborate with all parties involved.
Okay. So it's still my takeaway that there's no willingness to make a firm commitment if you receive assistance.
No, I thought I said.
I haven't heard anything.
I thought I said we are committed to providing that service through the end of 2021, or through the early part of 2021.
Okay, I mean, that's not how I read this, but I think this is worth further discussion. I do want to get to we asked a question about this. It was later in the agenda, but we asked it in our IRs. You're talking about needing rate increases to support a certain level of profitability. We've been here before, right? If in our questions, we asked about the 2 prior rate cases, Young Brothers entered into settlements. I won't have the dates at my fingertips. 2 prior rate cases with a projected rate of return. We asked the quote, what was the rate of return that you projected at the time?
Commissioner Griffin, I don't have that. Chair Griffin, I don't have that information in front of me. I don't know what the settlement.
Well, from my review of it, under both cases, you get based on your projections of your costs and the rate increase that we granted that you settled with the consumer advocate was 9.56%. So we can only work off of the projections you give us. So you told us at the time that rate increase was sufficient, you would be profitable, but you weren't. And so we find ourselves back here again. We found ourselves back here at the beginning of the year. We're getting more projections, but again, we have to have confidence of the commitment here. There needs to be a commitment to bringing sustainable, profitable operations, and there's multiple sides to the equation. It can't just come from customers. It can't just come from government assistance. So I don't know. So that's but again, when I hear that you become unprofitable and the system hasn't tried to address this, I think the factual basis of that's what we've asked for. We can disagree on it, but we've granted rate increases based on your projections with a sufficient level of profitability that your company projected. Is there a disagreement on that?
I can't speak to what happened in the settlements. I was not part of those discussions. All I can focus on is paving a path forward. I've committed, and I think I've demonstrated that through my leadership and with this leadership team that we've been transparent and we've provided the information needed to support any of these efforts. As it relates to profitability, I again point to the service and the price that we provide. We've continued, and our counterparts in the harbor will convey and reiterate that YB has continued to provide a reliable, low-cost service. If you benchmark our performance relative to our industry, we're the lowest and the cheapest game in town. From a freight forwarding perspective, again, we provide a service at a third of the price of our competition. And we have competition. Many think that it's that we secure and own all cargo throughout the state, and that's a misnomer because there's many different ways that people can move cargo throughout our state, and that is and has led to a degradation of our cargo volumes, which has contributed to some of those increases in costs or the rates.
Okay, I do. Given the time, I think we're going to modify slightly. We're going to allow one more round of questions because we've kind of bounced all over the place on the topics. I will reserve, for me, I just have one more at the end, and it'll be where you started on the question of fit, willing, able. But I know some of my fellow commissioners and some of the staff have follow-up questions based on our discussion. So I think we'll allow another round. Dean, I know you have more, but we do want to stay mindful of everyone's time here, but we'll continue forward for a little while longer. So maybe Dean Nishina.
Chair Griffin, I appreciate the opportunity, but I think I will at this point defer to the questions that commissioners and the commission staff might have, and I will on myself of whatever process might be developed to ask the questions either through written format or perhaps at a
Chair Griffin, we can't hear the CA.
Sorry, I apologize.
Oh.
I was just offering, I do have a number of questions, but I think, I would like to again defer to the commissioner's questions as well as the commission staff questions and maybe avail myself of whatever process might be developed within the docket to either ask my questions as in written format, or if there's another opportunity to engage in conversation.
Dean, that's very much appreciated. There'll definitely be more venues for further discussion because of the important emergency nature of this. So, Caroline Ishida, Chief Counsel, any further questions?
I do have more questions, but also in the interest of time, I can wait and follow up on those at another time. The only request I had was that YB provide the underlying data for the information on slide 20 related to the cost to ship the front load washing machine, the transportation mode relative numbers. It would be great if when you respond to the Commission's information requests on Monday, if you include that information. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Just to check, our Chief of Policy and Research, Dave Parsons, anything you want to follow up on?
No, I can do written form. Thanks.
Okay, Commissioner Suntien.
Yeah, I just had one more follow-up, but just to make sure I heard right. I think, and this was in the CA's first round of questions, and we're talking about, or he asked about when YB started to look for, the third-party financing and how much and the like. Wanted to make sure, right? I think it was Chris Edwards that responded and said something about recapitalizing the Capena tugs. That was one of the things that you guys sought to do while looking for that third-party financing, and whether or not that's part of the package or that was just the primary.
Leo, we lost a little bit of you on the back end of that. So
I just wanted to make sure, right? So you mentioned one of the things you guys were trying to do was to recapitalize the Capena tugs.
yes.
But that, my understanding is, or what I gather from that, that was not the primary thing that you guys were trying to do. It's part of the package, right? That makes up $25 million package.
Yeah. Yes. And I think if I hear you correctly, and stop me, in 19, that was what we were looking to do. The Capena tugs, the $80 million invested was fully equity, and so you'd like to rebalance that through some debt financing. That's what we were trying to do in 19. I think this indicative proposals that we're seeking with our banking partners at the moment, it's going to see what is in that book, that playbook available to us at this point in time, and so we would look to any and all options that we could be provided to provide some additional liquidity to kind of bridge us through this trying time.
Okay, thank you. That's all I had, Jay.
Thank you, Commissioner Suntien. Commissioner Potter.
Thank you, Chair. Appreciate the opportunity to ask more questions. All right, Jay, here we go. Mr. Anna. So I have a couple of questions. One of the topics that's really concerning to me right now is the proposed reductions or elimination of less than container load cargo. And I realize that it sounds like that's still on the table. And so I want to just ask a few questions around that. And this is in the event, it sounds like if you do not receive the full $25 million, that you would likely look to eliminating LCL load or LCL cargo as a resort to minimize or to minimize your losses or to decrease operational costs. And so in that, I think that some of these will be better handled through written IRs, but I do want to see if you have a sense of what those cost savings could be achieved by eliminating LCL cargo in terms of, it sounds like you've referred to it as being non-compensatory, but I'm curious on what level we're talking about in terms of cost savings by eliminating that. Can you speak to that briefly?
Yes, I can speak to that. I'm sorry, echoes. Is yours on? Hold on. Mike. Oh, can you hear me okay? Is there an echo? Okay.
Good.
So I guess, again, our focus is not to restrict or eliminate that service at this time. Again, it's because we want to continue to provide that universal service that differentiates us from other shippers. So that is not the immediate look. Now, from what we should all keep in mind is if we were to shut down LCL on a temporary basis, our issue also in terms of managing levers is that much of that cost is fixed, whether it's equipment leases, the lease rent, the benefits to the employees that maybe they don't get wage, but you still pay medical and all those other benefits. Because of those fixed costs, from a cash flow standpoint, and due to the loss of revenues weighing against the discontinued wage payment, it's basically a break-even cash proposition if you only closed it on the short term. So, keep in mind, it's not an immediate savings. There may be, it's slightly more than break even, but it's close to break even. Now, if we were to shut down the operation entirely, and again, that's not our intention, and that's why we don't want to go down this road. The preference is to continue to work to build towards more compensatory rates. I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, the total the net impact to our cost structure is how much? You have that number? Okay. Well, we have, it's a negative number. I don't have that number off the top of my head. I apologize.
That's
Does that
helpful.
make sense? The fixed versus variable components of running that business.
Yes, and I think that's one reason I was concerned is that you still have a tremendous amount of fixed cost associated with personnel that are on the docks. And whether you're receiving that type of cargo or not, they're still going to be there. And so, I'm really interested in the incremental cost associated with accepting LCL versus not, and what those kinds of savings will be. So I look forward to your responses in the IRs. That'll be helpful. Yeah. So just one other question, and then I'll yield my time. Is around the utilization rates of your barges. My question is, is Young Brothers looking at utilization rates for the space or to support the reduction of the reduced sailings? I think, does that make sense? So the amount of space on the
Chris Martin, you want to speak to that? You have okay. Hold on, I'm going to do the mute exercise.
Commissioner Potter, can you hear me?
I can hear you now, yes.
All right, thanks. Yeah, so we're managing it through bookings, and also so our capacity of our barges actually at this point can handle up, maybe 100 to 150 more containers. So we're managing it through both the booking levels and the current stowage on our vessels and barges going out.
So in other words, that it was part of your thinking, or when you looked at reducing the sailing schedules, you certainly looked at the utilization rates of the barges moving through each of the ports. Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you for that clarification. Great. And with that, Chair, I think I'll turn it back over to you for some questions.
Okay, I didn't mean to scare everyone off. You guys all yielded. So actually, I think I just have three. I said I had one, but now it's three. So for Jay, I'm sure you're aware, you've seen the volume of comments coming into the commission, the concerns about service from people all over the state, and the confusion people have. I mean, we've had multiple notices saying you're going to change service, flips back. So just, I mean, what can you tell us? What are you doing to improve that outreach communication to all the various islands affected, the various customers? Like, how can we get ahead of this better as we go forward. I think we appreciate the flexibility to try and restore service and work with that. But again, we want to be improving those relations with all of the people that depend on your service, not kind of leaving everyone confused. So can you speak to that for everyone here for a little bit?
Yes. So as I mentioned earlier, when we talked a little bit about customer impact, we understand the impact that some of these shifts have had on our customers. And we've tried to adjust throughout this pandemic, and even more so through this financial crisis, we most definitely, in hindsight, we could do a better job. And so what we do as a group is we re-evaluate consistently or constantly how we've made those communications. Now, again, because everything is happening so fast and furious, it's extremely difficult for us to get ahead of everything, and there's a lot of uncertainty. But we are very mindful of that, and we understand what impacts those have on our customers. What communications have on our customers. Sorry about that.
Okay, but anything specific you can tell us about, how you're doing more proactive outreach?
Yeah, so as I referenced, our sales team's constantly on the phone with different customers. Likewise, we've been constantly communicating with Neighbor Island delegates. Much of the reason why we made changes to both the Hilo as well as Molokai sailings were part of our outreach and our listening to what the customer's needs are. As I mentioned earlier, what we have to find a balance, and that's challenging when you're in this financial crisis. We're losing money, but we're trying to continue to provide these services that lose us money, and but we're understanding of the need and the vital service that we provide to these communities. We don't make any decisions solely based on a P&L, and I think that's apparent based on the fact that we continue to operate and in large part service. Throughout the pandemic, we faced challenges, and we're one of the very critical services that continued to operate as close to normal as that we could. Now, were there adjustments? Absolutely. Every business has had to make those to protect the safety, health, and welfare of our employees, but also to make sure that we put cost-cutting measures in place to help mitigate and offset those losses. As I mentioned a number of times, we've lost volumes to the tune of 30%. And that's, I think, that's a revenue tonnage measurement, and I think the slide after that will demonstrate from a revenue dollar standpoint that's closer to 40%. So it's a pretty significant number. And like all businesses, we've had to find ways to constrict. But unlike other businesses, we haven't been able to completely shutter our doors and only provide, say, takeout service and reduce staffing, because, again, especially as it relates to LCL, but really in the entirety of our business, once we open our gates due to safety measures, compliance measures, CBA measures, once we open our gates, we're staffed. And so I've used the analogy many times before, unlike a restaurant who is able to manage zones and staff accordingly based on volumes, right? So if you have peak time Saturday night dinner, you're fully staffed. If you have Tuesday 11 o'clock or 10 o'clock in between breakfast and lunch, you retract and you only do some takeout. The way that our business operates, you have to staff full almost at all times. And so it's either a barge day or a non-barge day. And for the vast majority of our business, which is in Honolulu, every day is a barge day. We employ 370 highly skilled, hardworking men and women throughout the state, but the vast majority of them run accumulation of 24 barges off loading and unloading here in Honolulu, and that takes time. Every single piece of cargo is touched by people, regardless of whether it's straight load, LCL, or mix. It's just a matter of how much it was touched. Straight load containers get touched. We're lucky twice or 3 times to take it off of a chassis, put it on the ground, and put it on a barge. LCL mix, that number's tenfold. So it takes time, and it costs money.
Okay, so I appreciate that. Again, the question was on customer service. We ask that continue to be proactive throughout this. Any change, what you're considering to change, or more importantly, if you're considering not changing things, that people are aware, and reach out to those that have written into us. I'm glad you got into this topic because it was where I was going next. If Andrew, if you can bring up slide 18. This is your statements from 2015 to current. And I mean, this, to me, this is the challenge. If we go back in time, company was profitable. I mean, as recently as 2017. So this is relatively recent. And, you know, you're showing the year-over-year projections, but, you know, as we've asked, if I just look at operating expense from 2015 to beginning of projected 2020, so this from the first column to the second to last, your operating expenses went up, or at least projected, and then 25 million. Revenue actually projected to go down. Obviously, that was exacerbated in, the last column is your forecast going forward. But again, in the beginning years of this, company was profitable. 2 years within this, company came in for rate cases. We were told that the amounts that you settled at would leave you acceptable to the company. You accepted the settlements. But yet this is what the results have been. And so we see, the decline in this structural problem. And so our challenge is we need to address the immediate, but without a commitment to bringing this in line, it brings us back to the starting point of this discussion. You said you're financially unfit. Our standard is fit, willing, and able. It's not fit, willing, or able. We don't get to choose 1, 2, or 3 of the total. It's got to be all 3. So we need the commitment to become fit, and it's a partnership, but everyone's got to work towards it. It can't come from assistance, and the expectation, it can't be all customer rates going up. I don't know what else to say, because I mean, if we can't guarantee all 3, I mean, again, I said our commitment is to provide continuous service, and we will fulfill that, but we need people that are fit, willing, and able. So any final comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess as it relates to the request for external support, access to CARES funding, the pandemic has hit all of us hard, and it is definitely the exception. It's a unforeseen circumstance, and it's really separate to really everything that we're looking at here. And so I look at that as a very independent need, extraordinary need. Now, as it relates to the rising costs and prior rate making, again, prior rate making, I can't speak to. That it is what it is. I'm not suggesting one way or another on the settlements. What I'm focused on here is paving a path forward. I did indicate cost containment is part of our plans. We have a commitment to continue to look at that and evaluate. But as I mentioned multiple times, the cost is there. There is a partnership that's needed on all parts. Young Brothers has continued to provide low-cost, reliable service to our customers. As we looked at the price of moving a washer at roughly a third of the price of our competition, who doesn't use the labor that is needed on the docks, they can't perform that service at the price that we perform it. We've done manage in the totality of our existence. We've done a good job of managing that cost, and we've provided that low-cost service to our customers. And we would like to be in a position, as I mentioned, and I don't disagree. It's all 3. It's fit, willing, and able. And we're here today to pave a path to become fit. We are not there today as I started, but we had intended to or intend to continue to work collaboratively with all. But what that requires is compromise on all parts. Customers have benefited from these low prices, and what we're asking is that there has to be some price increase. I'm not saying that all of this is on the burden of the customer. The burden is on all of us. It's the responsibility of the utility. It's the responsibility of the regulator. It's the responsibility of our legislators and other government agencies to come up with a solution that makes sure that this service is available for years to come.
Okay, I think that's a good stopping point for today. Thank you guys for your time. Thank everyone for their time here. As we noted at the outset, the commission has asked information requests of Young Brothers. We've asked that we hopefully see those submissions by June 15th. Those responses will be posted in the docket here as 2020-0084. In our closing, I do want to pause for any remarks from my fellow commissioners. Commissioner Asuncion.
I don't have anything, Kyle, but other than to thank you, Jay, and yes, it will take some tremendous work here, right? Given the circumstances and given past items, but I think speak for myself, but then I'm sure for the other commissioners, we do want to get to a resolution of this, right, and make sure that, right, it's fair for everybody. So we hear you, we hear, you know, at least I hear you, I hear what you're saying, but I think, right, we're going to have to really work hard on this one. So, but thank you.
Commissioner Potter.
Thank you so much for your time and your presentation today. I appreciate your team being here. And, you know, and as I mentioned to you before, the service that you provide to the state is critical and it's necessary. And we want to see you succeed in this. But as Jay mentioned, you know, this does have to come with sacrifices on all sides. It can't just be one or the other. And so I hope that we can find a resolution and path forward that helps everybody, you know, achieve what their objectives are here, which includes customer service and, you know, reliable transportation to the neighbor islands. That's just critical to our state. So looking forward to working with you in the future. I'm definitely looking forward to your responses on the IRs, the information requests that we submitted. So eager to see those and review those, and much to do in the weeks to come. So thank you very much for your time.
And I'll just say, I mean, this has been, and this will continue to be a high priority of our commission. We have an enormous number of our staff working on this. We'll continue to expeditiously investigate the matter. We're aware of external timelines to us with the legislature reconvening shortly, the importance of this matter. So we'll continue to work towards resolution. Thank you everyone for your attendance and participation. Thanks to all the viewers out there for helping make history with us. This will be our first, and seems like we'll have some more, but hopefully we'll check the recording later. Hopefully things worked out okay. Thank you for that, and thanks to everyone who's provided comments, and we will continue to work towards this. Thanks again to the Young Brothers team and our staff. In particular, folks have worked overtime to try and make all these accommodations and work on our technology. So thanks to our staff, in particular, Dave Parsons and Dave Takashima. When people see them in the future, give them a pat in the back from 6 feet away. And we'll all continue working forward towards resolution. Thanks everyone. Have a good rest of the day and afternoon.